Miriam was my mother-in-law, Anna Weprinsky's sister. And she wasn't technically part of this family, but they often came to family events. My mother-in-law had a small family as opposed to my father-in-law, who had all of us. And they died, and I wanted to write this for a couple of years now, but I finally wrote it one Saturday afternoon in Amagansett when I was there with Michael and his family. There are two words. Some of you will know these words and some of you may not. One word is bashert. It's meant to be, and some people use it to mean the person that they were meant to share their lives with, that's been preordained. The other word is zaftig, and I don't know, I don't want to point out examples of who is and who isn't, but you'll get it from...
Overweight.
Yeah, overweight, well, in the right places.
Yes.
I called the story, it's not a great title, but I called it That Day When. Miriam and Irving met in the Catskills. Like Miriam and Irving themselves, part of the Catskills were the product of the immigrant experience in America. The mountains provided a cool summer for the mostly Eastern European Jews accustomed to a hoarier climb, and who could now afford an escape from the generally hot and crowded neighborhoods, which at first had been the only life available to them, and which they now fashioned for themselves, still clinging to each other in this strange land of frightening promise. The Catskills were where growing families gathered for reunions, couples honeymooned, and singles came in the hope of meeting their basherts, so they too could follow the mostly unquestioned path of marriage and children and the good Jewish life in America. Irving was tall, and though not fat, he was large. His solidity was reflected in his character as well. He had a booming voice, a generous mustache, a toothy and frequent big smile, and a basso profundo voice. Miriam was small and dark and quite beautiful and softy. Truth to tell, Miriam had been married before to Mo, but Miriam had divorced Mo. To some men of that day, the fact of Mo in Miriam's life would have presented a deal breaker. But Miriam quickly came to see Irving as brilliant and handsome and everything a girl could want. So Irving was intoxicated by this little woman who was so energetic, beautiful, and admiring, indeed worshipful of him, and softy. They fell deeply in love and were soon married. They and everyone else knew they would be together always, until of course that day ever so many years from now when one would lose the other. Life, though full of promise, was not immediately easy for them. The Great Depression had left its mark on everyone's consciousness, and Irving was glad to have a job as the manager of a shoe store, even though it was far out on Long Island. And Miriam was a bookkeeper at The Level, the produce cooperative in Lower Manhattan, owned by her sister's husband and his extended family. Miriam and Irving compromised on an apartment in Ronkonkoma, mutually inconvenient for both of them. But they were blissfully happy. Miriam confided to her older sister Anna that Irving was a gentleman in bed, from which we concluded that Mo, at least in Miriam's estimation, was not. And Irving found that his bride was unfailingly cheerful and softy. It wasn't long, however, before the United States Navy joined Miriam in appreciating Irving's strengths, and they left Ronkonkoma. Miriam to live with her sister Anna and her family in Brooklyn, Abe and Anna and Jack and Saul, and Irving for the life of a cook in the Navy. When Irving was told that his unit would soon ship out for parts unknown, they both found it intolerable to think that Miriam would not know under what sky her Irving would be toiling. Well, years ago, Irving's father had rigged up a pulley system for Irving's mother to run the food from the kitchen to the sukkah without schlepping. So Irving came by his imagination and inventive qualities naturally. He used them now to beat the secrecy of the U.S. Navy. Loose lips sink ships, but on his last leave home before shipping out, before he himself knew where he would be, Irving gave Miriam a map of the world which corresponded to one he would take with him. Later, when he arrived at his destination, like any good husband, he wrote Miriam a letter. It was on a piece of paper the same size as the small map, and with a pinprick in it which corresponded to his new location on the map of which they both had a copy.
Very good.
Miriam received Irving's letter riddled with the careful censor's black rectangles blocking out what was thought to be sensitive material. But when Miriam held the letter with the pinprick over her copy of the map, censor be damned, she had all the information she needed to calculate where, and consequently what her Irving was doing at any given moment. All those miles apart, they were still together. This was not the time when one would lose the other. Meanwhile, Miriam worked diligently at the produce market and saved money for Irving's return when their life together would resume. And resume it did. Irving returned unharmed from his Navy stint, and they settled in Poughkeepsie, where Irving was a jack of a number of trades. More innovative than ever, Irving was always inventing things. One of the more promising designs was that for the perfect cheese dish, the shape of which would prevent unwanted mold. But a prototype needed for patenting would cost no less than $7,000. And while many people loved Irving, faith in Irving did not necessarily translate to $7,000 worth of faith in that cheese dish. The cheese dish was eventually patented, but by someone else who apparently had found $7,000. But there were always more inventions and hope. Meanwhile, Irving had found a niche for himself in insurance and Poughkeepsie real estate. Real estate business picked up, and with it, their beloved Laney was born, Elaine, from Miriam's beloved mother, Ita, who had not long before passed away from what was known as the sugar. Laney was joined a few years later by a baby brother, Albert, named for Abraham, Miriam's father, who had passed away a year to the day after his beloved wife, Ita, had died, that day when one had lost the other. He had died of grief, and too, the sugar. Life was good to Miriam and Irving, just as they themselves were good to everyone. They were the people everyone could depend upon. They surely were living the good Jewish American life. They had family, they had good true friends, they belonged to and often led all manner of civic organizations, and Miriam volunteered and racked up more donor credits than Irving had good salesman jokes. Irving, still tall, more solid and smiling than ever, was now truly a pillar of their community, and Miriam, his loving partner, was still energetic, and yes, softed. After many years, Poughkeepsie's charm started to fade. A major road was built much too close to their erstwhile idyllic house and garden. Their famous outdoor gatherings with the sumptuous food, much of it prepared by Irving. Even the pickles were cured in their very own basement, and the lox was sliced by Irving's perfectly designed lox-slicing knife, now happened against the constant traffic sounds of Route I-22. Others also became disenchanted with Poughkeepsie, and neither real estate nor insurance were what they had been. And then, of course, there were the winters. So Florida and Florida-bound friends beckoned. Poughkeepsie life was recreated in Florida. Irving was still the go-to man for comfort or good advice on almost anything. Miriam did bookkeeping and was there for her Irving in any and all of his endeavors. They celebrated their 60th anniversary. People came from all over enthrall over the longevity of such a successful union. Irving still personable. Miriam just smiled, but was still pretty and zaftig, and time went on. Laney, their daughter, now living in Albany with her family, and Albert, a music producer in Malibu, decided perhaps it was time to think about the next step in their beloved parents' lives. They all met in Florida for a visit and a powwow. While there, Irving had some minor medical issue and was admitted to the local hospital. And each day, with Miriam, they all visited Irving and had a high old time of it in his hospital room, knowing that he would be discharged later in the week. One morning, after breakfast, just before leaving for the hospital, Miriam slumped forward in pain, and then lost consciousness, clearly a heart attack. Albert quickly called Irving's number to tell him just that they would be delayed, but that they would get there that afternoon. Strangely, Irving's doctor answered Irving's phone. Hearing what Albert was excitedly explaining to him, he interrupted, saying, "Well, I can't tell Irving about Miriam's heart attack, you see. I was just going to call you. Your father himself just had a heart attack, and I'm afraid, well, he's gone." Irving was buried in Albany 2 days later. 2 days after that, having never regained a consciousness that we could recognize, never having been told by us of her beloved Irving's death, Miriam too was buried in Albany. For Miriam and Irving, that day of loss just never happened. And of course, for a lot of us of a certain age and certain experience, that kind of a loss is something which, even if we haven't experienced it yet, we think about, and it resonates for a lot of us. So I thought that was the ideal. I thought if only we could all plan it that way.
It's a beautiful story.